In this lesson, we'll learn about Softimage's parameter connection editor. The name gives away what the parameter connection editor does. It's used to link or connect parameters together. What's great is that that can be done in a relative way, meaning that our driving parameter, if that were set to a max value of 5, we can have the driven parameter set to a max value of 300. So as we take the driving parameter and move that to 5, the driven parameter can be set to that amount of 300. We'll understand this clearly as we rig our tail flap. What's also neat about the editor is that we can go back and adjust the way our values interpolate or transition. So those are a few things we'll discuss. So let's say we get right to work. We'll go to View, Animation, Parameter Connection Editor. So we have our driving source, what's going to control everything, and the driven target, what's being controlled. We know that the driving source is our tail flap parameter, so let's go ahead and grab our ship control. When we scroll down, we'll see the extra parameters we've added. Let's go ahead and lock this panel down so it doesn't refresh on us. If you needed to add another object as your driving source, simply select the object and choose Refresh. Also, depending on what you see in the editor, you can use the two menus, driving source or driven target, to filter what you see. The default is going to work for us, keying panel parameters. Kind of cleans things up, so we're just working with what we need to. All right, let's go ahead and take care of the driven target side. We know that's going to be our tail flap, so we could always select that and load that in by choosing Refresh. Now, before we start to control this tail flap, let's go ahead and take a look at its pivot. We'll just use the Move tool. You can see that its pivot is not on top of the object. It's going to be more convenient to set this up with the pivot centered, so we know how to do that. With the object selected, we'll go to Transform and choose Move Centered to Bounding Box. And more often than not, it's helpful to work with clean transform values. Things can go by a lot faster that way. So with the object selected, we'll also set a neutral pose. Okay, great. All right, so the next step is to link the parameters together so Softimage knows what parameters are going to be linked and controlled. So let's go ahead and grab our tail flap custom parameter on our driving source side. What's going to be driven is going to be the position X. We'll control click position Z and all of our rotate parameters. Once all of these have been selected, we can link them together. You can see that the animation icons have changed, letting us know that these parameters have been connected via the connection editor. Something important to keep in mind is that we can no longer animate directly on these parameters. If we wanted to, we would need to select the parameter, right-click and choose Remove Animation, which will clear that connection out. Okay, now we're just about ready to set our relative value, but first what we need to do is make sure we're in our default position, which we are right now. Our values are set to 0. Also, what's set to 0 is our tail flap parameter. You can see that by selecting the ship, which we can do from the driving source side. Taking a look at our tail flap parameter, that's also set to 0. Okay, so everything is at default. So the next thing we need to do is take the custom parameter again. Let's make sure that's selected. Make sure that the right parameters are selected on the driven target side, and we'll need to choose Set Relative Value to lock this default position in or record it. Now, going back to our ship control, we'll go to the tail flap and set this to -10. So let's say when we get to a value of -10, we have the flap move to the right side. So with that in mind, once the value has been set and determined, we can now select our tail flap and get to work. Let's go ahead and move this over in the x-axis, and we can also start to rotate it in place so it looks like an accurate tail flap. So we can start to rotate it in the y-axis. It's a good idea to keep in mind the values that you use. That way you can use the reciprocal on the opposite side. And not all values will be flipped when it's time to work on the opposite side. You'd mainly want to be concerned with flipping your position x-axis, your rotation y and z-axes also. But everything else should be good to go. I actually have values that we can work with to get this done a lot faster. So for our position x, we can use a value of negative 0.57. In our position z, we'll add a slight shift, put in a value of 0.1. In our rotation x, let's use a value of negative 5. Rotation y, a value of 40. And the rotation z, negative 17. Okay, great. So once that's in place, again, making sure everything is selected in the parameter connection editor, we can now choose set relative values. Now watch this. If we were to select our ship again and start to slide that parameter, you'll see that we are now controlling the right direction of our tail flap, which is really neat. Okay, so now it's time to have that flap in the opposite direction. Let's go ahead and set our max value of 10, and we'll get right to work putting in reciprocal values. So selecting the tail flap in the position X, we can use a value this time of positive 0.57. The Z-axis, that will not be flipped, so we'll need to use that same value of 0.1. Also, the rotate x-axis will not be flipped, so we'll use that value of negative 5. The y-axis will most certainly need to be flipped, so we'll put in a value of negative 40. And we'll also need to flip the rotate z-axis, so that's going to be positive 17. Okay, great. So again, making sure everything is selected, we'll need to grab that tail flap custom parameter and go ahead and choose set relative value. Alright, so if we were to now close this out, select our ship control, notice we're controlling our tail flap. So this is really neat stuff. And notice this is a relative change. When we're at a value of 10 on our tail flap, those values are most certainly not set to 10. They're set to what they need to be set to for us to get this type of behavior. Later on, when we work with expressions, we'll learn how to do direct connections with no relative change. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how this all can be edited. So if we were to select the object that has been connected to, we can go ahead and click on one of these animation marks that have the parameter connection editor icon, and that's going to load up our animation editor. So what we see here are F-curves, which show us how our values interpolate. And what we also see are little points that represent our keys that were used to create or record these values. We'll learn about F-curves and keyframes when we get into our animation section, but know that you can most certainly go in and change your values to something different if you ever wanted to. So notice that value of 17, that can be changed from here to, let's say, 20, and now that's the new position for that object. But chances are we want to bring that back to 17, but you have a lot of control here. Now also keep in mind that right now we're getting this type of smooth interpolation, and ease out of one key and ease into the last key. When instead, we probably want more of a constant speed, a linear interpolation. So, if that's the case, we could always select our keyframes and choose linear. And again, what that's going to do is make sure that there's no delay as we move that tail flap. So we'll learn more about interpolation again as we discuss the animation editor in the animation section of this course. All right, but now we can go ahead and test this out. Beautiful. So in a case like this, we won't notice a major change, but when working on a larger control system, that change would most certainly be noticeable. All right, but I'm going to go ahead and now zero this back out. We have finished our tail flap. So let's say we move on to another topic in the following lesson.